Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Grains and Legumes Nutrition Council webinar. We're really thrilled to have you on board today as we really look at and deep dive into sustainable opportunities for grain and legume industry. We know this is a really hot topic, and we're hoping that by bringing you this webinar today, we're going to be able to see some future forecasting and really look at the opportunities for our industry, whether it comes to food manufacturing, growing, or even the consumer end of things. My name is Charlotte Strand. I am the Marketing Communications Manager at GLNC. I'll be your moderator today, so if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat function down below. We'll also be running Q&As throughout the session as well, so it's really giving you an opportunity to speak directly to our speaker and also GLNC. Today, we're really thrilled to have Edge Environment on the call. Edge are the leading sustainability consultant in Australia, looking at working with partners across the supply chain, whether it be in food or otherwise, really helping brands understand their sustainability opportunities and how they can move forward. Today, we're joined by Mark Siebentritt. So Mark, welcome aboard. Mark is the General Manager of Edge Tech and is one of the directors of Edge Environment. Mark, I'll pass it over to you and we'll get things kicked off. Just a reminder, if you do have any Q&As, chuck them in there, and yeah, we're looking forward to seeing your presentation.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Charlotte, for that introduction and also for the opportunity to speak with everyone today. It's a really interesting issue that's impacting all parts of our community and economy, and it's really looking forward to unpacking it with you today in terms of what I'll cover, but also hearing back from you as to what your own reflections are. I'd first like to kick off just by acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Kaurna people. I'm based in Adelaide, and I want to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and also recognise their ongoing spiritual connection with the land here in the Adelaide Plains. So the topic of today is emerging issues and opportunities in sustainability as it relates to your industry and grains and legumes. What I thought I'd do in terms of just kicking off is give you a bit more insight as to who Edge Environment is. So we're a sustainability services company, started in Sydney in 2008. Now we have offices in Sydney, Melbourne, in Adelaide, also in Auckland in New Zealand, Boston in the US, and Santiago in Chile. So the team's grown quite substantially over time, but throughout that whole journey, we've evolved our offering to cover science, strategy, and storytelling. And I think it's interesting in terms of where we're positioned now, even having this conversation, as to why this is so important, this combination of three factors. So we started with a very strong focus on making sure the science, the technical rigor was behind what we do. But ultimately, we're a business where our vision is a world where unsustainable is unthinkable. So there's clearly a need to link science and strategy to make sure we're informing decision-making. What we also in recent years started to bring in more was that the leadership, the communication, the storytelling piece, because we recognise that if you're not able to combine all science, strategy and storytelling, you're not going to have the type of impact that we're keen to see. And as we'll see right towards the end of the presentation, that storytelling piece is really significant for those organisations, sectors, businesses who are looking at taking a leadership position. So we'll unpack a little bit what leadership means. In terms of who we work with, there's a broad range of sectors we work with, a large range of businesses. So we work with the public sector and the private sector. This is just an example of some of the organisations we work with in the private sector. To just give you an idea, there's a spread there across fast-moving consumer goods, right through to we ultimately work with financial services sector, agriculture, property sector, health services sector as well. So, I think what this is illustrative of as well is that sustainability now has changed dramatically in terms of the parts of our economy that it reaches. And really there is, perhaps you could argue, no part of the corporate landscape in particular where sustainability is not getting picked up at a rate of knots. But I think, let's reflect a little bit on what do we mean by sustainability. So I'm really fortunate, I feel, to have had a background where I've worked a lot with growers and producers over the past. My original part of my career was in the water industry and spent a lot of time working with irrigators and farmers back then. And in the early days of consulting with a lot of dryland cropping farmers as well. And to me, when we talked about sustainability, say 10 to 15 years ago, a lot of it was on all the fantastic work that was being done around sustainable land and water management. And so sustainability and sustainable land and water management went hand in hand, and reflecting on the fantastic work that came out of movements like land care. So that's one framing of sustainability. But the way that we describe sustainability now and the type of work we do is evolving rapidly. It's been heavily influenced by the United Nations, who put together what are called the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're very clearly looking now at sustainability as it relates to economic, environmental, and social aspects. And so in some ways, sustainability is sometimes considered just to be the environmental piece, but very clearly, if we look globally, sustainability as a concept now is really being set up to cover all three of these different pillars. And some of you will recognize that as being the elements of a triple bottom line approach. The other piece here is that governance then is becoming a really big part of sustainability. So the governance piece being how are we making the decisions that influence whether our operations are sustainable or not. If we do a bit more of a deeper dive in this, the other factor is ESG, which is a term that's increasingly being referenced now and used in conjunction with sustainability. And for those of you connected with, I suppose, larger businesses and larger corporate organisations, ESG and ESG reporting is really very significant. I hosted a forum in Adelaide last night on the move to a low carbon economy, and I had Telstra as one of our speakers, and they noted that they've gone from a point where they had a smaller environment team going back 5 or 6 years ago, where occasionally there'd be requests for the sort of work they do. And now their comment was pretty much every day or multiple times per week, they're getting queries around their ESG approach. So it's really expanded a lot. I suppose that the key point here is that ESG is the full spectrum of non-financial issues. And so it covers the environmental, social, and governance. And so you can see it's slightly different from the previous slide. I won't go through all the specific elements of each of the ESG, because we'll come on to what I see as some of the broader mega trends, if you like, a little bit later that I think are relevant. But one of the things to reflect on here is that there's different ways or perhaps different lenses to understand what we describe as corporate sustainability. And, some of those, the drivers, they're going to depend on factors like, how mature or well-developed is an organisation or a sector's approach to looking at sustainability. Who are the key stakeholders you're interacting with and what do they want? And also what's the underlying business model? And so I think one of the reasons I like putting this up is that sustainability often gets tied in with multiple different terms. And what we'd say is that rather than sort of a debate as to what is and what isn't sustainable, really they're just at different ends of a spectrum. So we'd see that CSR, corporate social responsibility, was something which is probably on the far left. They're a little bit more reactive. ESG, triple bottom line, is more in the middle. And then for-purpose organisations, so Edge Environment, we're a for-purpose organisation. We're a B Corp, so we believe in businesses as a power for good. We've been in the for-purpose category. But there's increasingly really strong conversations around regenerative businesses. So businesses that actually leave our landscape, our environment, and our community in a better way than they found it in the first place. And so when we're looking at sustainability, while there are broad concepts and terms, we recognise that there are people are at different points in the journey, and we'll choose to be at different points on the spectrum. One of the things I wanted to note here is, just to reinforce the rise in references and interest in issues like sustainability, and also if we use ESG as a surrogate for that. And this is really interesting, just looking at Google search statistics around the term ESG. We can see that for, very much the early 2000s through till about probably 4 years ago, there were lower levels of interest. It was regular interest, but lower levels, and then it really has spiked in recent years. And a lot of the clients we work with, what they would say is that investor relations parts of their businesses are really busy now with requests around ESG. And, just to underline that, one example is some of you may be familiar with BlackRock. So BlackRock is the largest private equity firm in the world. Larry Fink, their CEO, sends out a letter every year explaining their expectations for investment. And in a recent letter, he said to all of the businesses they invest in that if they're not clear on how they're responding to climate change, they won't invest in them. And so I think that's a reflection of how investment and financial decision-making is influenced in the way sustainability is being addressed. So, that was a little bit of an intro into perhaps reframing sustainability from how it might be perceived in the sector to how we see it and what we're seeing through corporates and investors. And very much, I suppose, linked with that is that there's a greater realisation of the business value of sustainability. So on one hand, we're doing it because we recognise it's important and there's underlying value in just being sustainable in general, but also there is business value in that. And information around the business case behind sustainability just continues to grow and grow and grow. So it doesn't take much Googling at the moment to find some of the background information on this. And one of the other interesting comments from Telstra last night, they had a question from the floor, which was that, how do they do the trade-off decision-making around when they invest in sustainability or not? And the response was, there is no extra budget for it, but in many instances, it just stacks up now. So in the past, perhaps it may not have, but there is a clear business case for taking action around sustainability, which means they're just getting on and doing it, which was a fascinating insight. So there's a couple of different ways of framing the business value. So one of them is that it supports long-term financial resilience. And I won't unpack this too much, but one of the things that we'd see is that, reducing portfolio vulnerability. So a lot of interest from companies around things like climate risk, which I'll unpack a little bit more in a few moments, that can have a big impact on portfolio vulnerability. But the key message here is that a focus on sustainability can help with that long-term financial resilience. The other thing is, and this has got really, really strong off the back of COVID, and there'll be, I'm sure, lots of interesting research and PhDs done out in the future is how these tie together, but that recognition of the value of the world we live in, a sustainably managed community, is getting recognised more and more amongst customers and suppliers. And so that's a really strong part of the business value of sustainability as well. So what I wanted to do really for the majority of the presentation is to focus a bit on the different sustainability trends that we see. And so what I'm going to do is just pick out, I've got 7 examples of elements of sustainability that we and I believe are quite important, and I just wanted to flag with you. And what I'm interested in is your reflections on how this relates to your industry and your sector. So the first one is around climate risk. So we're regularly hearing about climate change, climate risk, net zero. It's interesting actually with the federal election, there's not as much discussion around climate change as there has been in the past, but climate risk has a particular meaning for people like myself that's really relevant to the way a lot of larger businesses are now operating, and our view is that will filter out right across the economy. So to unpack that a little bit, one of the big changes that's really happened is that traditionally it was seen as just an environmental issue. And so if you talked about climate change, you would end up talking with environmental officers, or it was just an environmental issue. But really that's changed, and I'd say that those days are largely gone. And one of the reasons is that there's a recognition that climate change is presenting financial, economic, legal and governance risks. And it's interesting, again, reflecting on the panel session we held here last night, where one of the speakers from a company called Discovery Parks, who's one of Australia's largest, or if not the largest leisure park provider, he was here speaking about their work on net zero and low carbon. He's the chief financial officer. So this is being addressed at a C-suite level and by the CFO. So it's fascinating insight. But we might say, what's behind that? One of the things that's behind that is that if you look at organisations like the World Economic Forum have really driven a greater recognition of climate as a risk to the global economy, not as purely as an environmental issue. It is an environmental issue that poses an economic risk. And so these reports are presented every year by the World Economic Forum. And if you look down the bottom there at 2007, what you'll see, and you can match the colours up with on the right-hand side, essentially all of the risks that were being looked at from a likelihood and impact perspective, they related to things like societal risks, they were geopolitical, they're also economic. If you fast forward, what you'll see is the greens start to appear more and more and more. And as we get towards 2019 and 2020, we've got a lot more environmental risks that are coming up. And these are not just environment for environment's sake, they're environmental risks that pose a risk to the global economy. And so climate risk is getting increasingly recognised through that financial lens. Another one, and this is almost a talk in its own, so I'll give you the snapshot on it, is climate change being recognised as a legal issue. And it's fascinating now to see Australian Institute of Company Directors has a much, much stronger focus on raising awareness around climate change as a governance risk. A lot of that's driven by this legal issue here. And the short of it is that from a legal perspective, there's work done now to say that climate change is both a material and a foreseeable risk. And so what that means is if you're a director of a private company or of a public authority, if there are risks that are foreseeable and material, you need to take action on them. And if you don't, there could be consequences. And if we look at somewhere like New Zealand at the moment, they are currently drafting their legislation around climate risk disclosure, and it potentially has prison terms for directors who don't disclose this type of risk. So it's really becoming a serious issue. And when that impacts what's going on for directors, what we know is that ultimately filters out through the entire economy. Just a little footnote on this is that there's an entity called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful, but what it is a standard global way of doing risk reporting for climate change. And what it suggests is that this is going to impact all parts of the economy. It's not something that's just an international piece or an international framework. This will be impacting every sector. It will impact your sector. It may be something you're already experiencing, or it may be that organisations you work with across your supply chain are already responding to this. So it will ultimately have an impact on all of us. And you might be thinking, well, you know, Mark, this sounds a little bit maybe far-reaching in your comments there. You know, who's actually disclosing? Who's aligning with that framework? Well, these are just some of the examples of the companies in Australia who are aligning. And, you know, what we know is, for example, the Commonwealth Bank, off the back of their TCFD work, has committed to assess every single mortgage in their portfolio to understand the risk that it's presented with. And we'll see the Coles Group, who I dare say is very relevant to your sector. They are doing TCFD work. Woolworths is doing TCFD work. So big businesses better understanding their climate risk means that that'll ultimately filter out through the entire supply chain. So climate risk is an issue to be aware of. There's also an opportunity then for those members in sectors and those organisations who are really on the front foot and demonstrating how they're addressing this nice and early. Next one I just wanted to mention, which I think is particularly relevant to your sector, is around offsets. So when we're talking about the move towards carbon neutrality and emissions reduction, ultimately what we're saying in an organisation like ours, we work with our clients to say, how do we avoid, reduce or replace your emissions? So emissions are as a result of different products that are being provided or generated, different goods or even services. But for many organisations, in fact, most at the moment, at some point, there are limits to what they can reduce their emissions to. And so it means that there will be some sort of reliance on offsets. And the reality is that many of those offsets will be generated out in our regional areas. They'll be generated out on out in farms and areas of natural landscapes that are being actively managed. So this is an area where the demand for this continues to rise at a rate of knots, and inevitably there will be opportunities that come up within that. Just in terms of, you know, the nature of what's happening in the offset space, this is fascinating. So the price in the last 12 months for carbon offsets in Australia went up by 180%. So now that's still jumping around a bit. There are some regulatory changes that are underway, but the bottom line is that if offsets present an opportunity for your sector as a whole in many different ways, this is a space that's not sitting dormant anymore. It's rapidly growing. One of the reasons it's rapidly growing is that the European Union has announced that by 2026, all imported goods into the European Union will end up having to pay a carbon tariff. They've led with by 2023, I think it's steel and some other metal products, but by 2026, it will be all goods. And so what that means is that anyone looking to export to Europe will need to factor in how they become net zero. And for most, that will mean acquiring offsets. So that demand is going to drive prices. It's interesting just in the offsets piece is that, and this is just a note here to say that the way that market is evolving, it's maturing quite rapidly. And so offsets aren't offsets anymore. There's going to be different qualities of offsets. And one thing for a sector like yours to look at is, you know, where do you play in this space and how do the offsets you might be able to generate or connect yourself with, how they differ from others. So, you know, a pine forest offset in the US and California, which is that example on the left, would be very different from what you might be looking at in your sector. In fact, in your sector, you might find that it's not just carbon, it's biodiversity as well. And I'll show in a few slides' time that there is a huge rising interest in biodiversity offsets as well. And there's a really interesting story to be told as to how biodiversity in farming and food production are connected. The final little note here is that, in this offset space, for anyone who's interested in it, it's rapidly evolving and there is regulation that will be coming together very quickly. So this is, it's no longer something, and it hasn't been for a while, but no longer something where you can think, I'll plant a few extra mallee trees in the back corner of a paddock and hope to get some carbon offsets at some stage. The regulation around this is growing at a rate of knots. So there's big opportunities around offsets, but there are also some risks that need to be managed. Another one of the macro trends is around supply chain and key customer targets. What we're finding is that companies now that we work with are digging deeper and deeper and deeper into their supply chains. And what that means is that if you're working particularly with very large retailers, if they haven't already, they will at some point want to be having discussions around the type of issues we're exploring today. So, traceability becomes really, really important. So traceability of things like emissions and other aspects of sustainability right across the supply chain. And also, how do you set goals at different points in the supply chain? And so this slide here just gives some examples of the type of issues that are going to crop up. So at the top, that diagram there is about what are called scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And really that's shorthand for looking at what are all the different types of greenhouse gas emissions that can link to a company. But scope 3 is the really significant one because they are supply chain emissions. So you would fully expect that at some point, if it hasn't happened already, large retailers would start to want to understand and work with some of you around better understanding their supply chain emissions, and that fits into scope 3. An interesting example of this is we've been working with a large global fashion retailer, and while we started off at a very high level of around trying to understand what the broad emissions were associated with their business, they've got to the point where they want to understand what are the emissions associated with the inner sole in their shoes. And in order to do that, they need to track right back through their supply chain. So this is a heads up that better understanding and engaging across the supply chain is definitely on its way. And, biodiversity and natural capital, there's been a recognition of the importance of this for, a very long time. And I think to my mind, land managers and growers, more than almost anyone out in the community, understand the importance of natural capital and biodiversity and healthy ecosystems, because without that, we can't produce food. But what this slide here is flagging is that internationally, again, there's a growing recognition of the role of biodiversity and getting to a point where biodiversity can be paid for in its own right. I think, in many ways, if we look back at that land care experience around where land care was about having sustainable land and water management as well as farming systems, there's the potential in the future to not just have that sustainable land and water management being recognised as important, there's a potential to be paid extra for that. And so the ability to have premiums paid, particularly around carbon offsets, which deliver both on carbon and biodiversity, is really significant. So this is a global trend that we're starting to see, and there are companies in Australia who are exploring how they can tap into this. Changing consumer demands is another one, and this is definitely strong off the back of COVID and something that we're seeing, and I'd be interested to hear whether it's something you're seeing as well in your sector. And some of the key stats here are that 66% of consumers are now saying that they're willing to pay more for a socially responsible product or service, and 89%, let's call it 90%, would swap to a more ethical brand. This is really interesting because it wasn't that long ago that it was seen that people really had to be willing to pay a premium, and there was a question as to whether they were willing to do that. The latest research is suggesting that there's a much greater willingness to pay extra for socially responsible products or services. What this says to me, though, is then understanding sustainability across the supply chain becomes really, really important in order for consumers to be able to see this and understand this. And so the opportunity here is, how do you tell your story? So A, what are you doing around sustainability? But B, how are you going about telling that story? Sixth point is around diversity, inclusion, and equality. And, I mentioned earlier on that I suppose in times gone by, sustainability was just synonymous with environment, but very clearly sustainability now encompasses environment and social impacts. That's very clear from work that's done by the United Nations. And if you look at sustainability strategies of major corporations, it is both environment and social. One of the big pushes on social are issues like modern slavery, where clearly there's legislation in Australia around this. It's really interesting to note here, for example, if you look at where Australia's positioned around, for example, female representation in the ag sector, where, well behind where the OECD figures are. So, this is a flag that while I've talked about climate risk, offsets, and other aspects of sustainability like biodiversity, diversity, inclusion, equality is a significant issue as well, and certainly deserves attention as part of consideration around sustainability and sustainability strategies. The last trend I wanted to touch on was just around packaging. And I've got to admit, coming into today, I wasn't 100% clear on how this is dealt with in your sector. Obviously, broadly aware of packaging across food supply chain, but how much of packaging that relates to grains and legumes you're dealing with. The reason for including it here, though, is to say that this only continues to rise as an issue. It's largely wrapped up in concepts around circular economy. So in moving towards circular economy, we're aiming for a world where we're closing the loop as much as possible. And of the packaging that is produced, that as much of it is reused, recycled, and then we end up with a movement towards zero waste. So heads up and a reminder that packaging continues to be a significant issue, not just globally, but also nationally. So they were the 7 overarching trends, and I've sort of obviously moved through those quite quickly, but I did that because I wanted to touch before we wrap up on the principles for sustainability leadership. And I think this is something that's become really significant in recent years, particularly with renewed concerns around greenwashing. And we would have all heard about greenwashing in the past. And as there's particularly a stronger focus now on disclosure of how organisations are tackling sustainability, greenwashing has come up again as an issue that needs to be tackled. And so we did some research recently led by our head of leadership and communications, Ashley Gay, and her team, who did a brilliant job on developing a report on the principles for sustainability leadership. And so just to read off here, what these principles are designed to do is really help you work out where are you on your journey to sustainability leadership, and then give you some ideas and inspiration to drive change faster. And we recognise that not everyone or every organisation or every sector is at the same point, and that's okay, and that's completely to be expected. The key message here is to work out where are you on the journey, and then understand what else needs to be done to take the next steps. So this slide here covers off on what those 10 principles are for sustainability leadership. And this in itself could be a whole hour presentation. So what I'm proposing here is I won't go through each of these in detail. What I wanted to do was to pick out 3 and just make some observations around those, but more than happy to unpack these further during the Q&A session if you like. So the first one is to pinpoint where you want to lead and where you don't. And what this is recognising is that it's very, very difficult to lead on every aspect of sustainability. As you'll have seen through this presentation, there are a large number, or I've identified 7 mega trends, but even going back to that earlier ESG slide, there are a lot of elements around sustainability. And so, what we'd suggest, whether it's businesses, public authorities or sectors, is to work out where do you actually want to lead and where don't you? So where do you want to take a leadership position, and where might you say we're happy to stay with the rest of the pack? So yeah, pinpointing where you want to lead is a really key consideration. The second one is working out how does sustainability align with your corporate affairs and marketing plans. I think this is particularly important around the governance piece. So as you'll see, there's a drive for a lot of larger businesses now to get the governance piece right, and this plays directly into that. And so determining how sustainability sits within your corporate strategic plan, even marketing plans, is really significant. And that then plays into how you position yourself as leaders. Again, where do you want to lead and how you're positioning that and communicating it? And then how does that broadly link to how you're communicating your messages right across the supply chain and to various consumers and to stakeholders? The last of the 3 that I was going to mention, and obviously there's a lot on this slide and we can unpack it further, but the last one is around measuring performance using quantitative and qualitative indicators. really, if sustainability is something you're looking at going on that journey to a greater degree, this is a really important point, and it plays back to that message around greenwashing, and that we're still at a point where there are some pretty big claims made by some organisations around what they believe they're doing. And our view and our experience is being that you really need to back that up with evidence, and that evidence can either be quantitative or qualitative indicators. But there were times when companies might claim, or even sectors might have claimed to be carbon neutral or close to being carbon neutral, but without having evidence around your emissions and knowing what your emissions are in relation to those scopes 1, 2, and 3, without having that evidence and then knowing what you're doing to reduce emissions, you really can't be making those claims. Now, that's only one example, but the key point there is to say, if you're looking at taking sustainability leadership position, or generally just communicating what you're doing on it, you really need to back it up with some hard evidence. So just in summarising, I wanted to focus in on 3 takeaways. The first one is that the focus on sustainability is not going away. And the evidence to me for this is that it's not just driven anymore by government policy. And we've seen in things like climate that government policy can change depending on which political party might be in government at the time. What we're seeing now is that the focus on sustainability is being very strongly driven by the investor community, and they're not changing that because they see that there are financial and legal implications of not getting this right. So the message is that sustainability is not going away, and it's only going to continue to evolve and be refined in exactly what it means to different sectors. The second point here is just to recap a message I only touched on recently in one of the slides, but I think it is an important issue. Is so you don't have to be a sustainability hero at everything. It's working around what are your strengths and getting some of the basics right. And I think a sector like the one you're working in, there are so many good things that are being done and that have been done in the past to harness. And so there's a great question in the conversation here around, what are the bits you want to champion? And the last point here is that I've got here that compliance is the start of the value journey. But in many regards, compliance is actually going to start to rise and rise, in our opinion. We see this with modern slavery. We see it with climate risk disclosure, and our view is that's only going to continue to rise. And so what that's going to mean is it'll ultimately set the bar as to what the minimum step-in point is for discussions and work on sustainability. So with that, I'd just like to thank you for your time. I know we've covered a lot in that presentation, but I think it really demonstrates how we're moving on from perhaps observations or thoughts on sustainability that might have existed 10 or 20 years ago into now quite a complex and ever-expanding issue that's being dealt with by corporates, but ultimately right across the economy and community.